Okay, so without much further ado, welcome to the fourth panel of the STARTS conference, which will have as a focus the epistemologies and methodologies of particular forms of interdisciplinary collaboration. My name is Tomás Criado. I'm an anthropologist. I'm working here at the Open University of Catalonia. I have been for years, a practitioner working together with urban planners and architects and disability rights activists. That is sort of my interdisciplinary background, also connected to the field of STS, Science and Technology Studies. And we have here a number of very interesting presentations which will be helping us discuss the very questions that we wanted to address in this panel. Namely, we're interested in trying to understand how the interdisciplinary encounter, or the collaborative moment that many interdisciplinary projects sort of create, as one in which we need to start screening the different epistemic or epistemological foundations that, the issues, the questions of the different people, the different forms of knowledge and knowledge production that come at the encounter, at the interdisciplinary encounter. So we would like to discuss in each of their presentations, I'm going to introduce their work in a bit, we would like to understand how these different epistemic backgrounds, these different forms of epistemic or disciplinary even aims and motivations, how they somehow underpin, create frictions, produce problems, but also in some circumstances they might be helping out. We also would like to discuss this, not just in abstract forms of knowledge production, but speaking about the hows. So one of the main issues of this panel would be to start discussing the different approaches, the different forms of doing that you have been working with in your different projects, right? So it's not just the knowledge as in the what, we're also interested in the knowledge as in the how, and how those hows create conflicts, forms of, they facilitate encounters, enable things, or somehow disable them, right? So we will be trying to pay attention to processes, practices, perspectives, and dynamics that happen in those forms of interdisciplinary collaboration. And in the end, so basically we're going to be having the 5 presentations sequentially, and after that we're going to be opening up 3 blocks of questions in which we're going to try to explore and debate a bit more at length some of these questions, right? So the challenges, and perhaps if you have any suggestions for solutions, right? So in today's panel, in order, we're going to be having with us Jessica Coldrey, an independent engineer who will be talking about epistemologies of healing, hybrid visual research in flood-affected communities. Thank you, Jessica, for being here. Carolyn Kirschner, from Goldsmiths University at London, who will be presenting a case for intentional misuse of scientific tools and processes as a productive approach to art science research. Then Guillemette Legrand from the Ecole des Arts Décoratifs and the Basel Academy of Art and Design, who will be speaking about computing tragedies with Hector. Carla Molins-Pitarch from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia, who will be speaking about the transdisciplinary design toolkit, lab to street, tangible science framework to collaborative, oh my goodness, tangible science framework to collaboratively create art, tech, and science experiences. And the panel will end with a presentation from Maxim Velli and Lola Kengen from the Learning Planet Institute in Paris. So without much further ado, I would like to give the floor to you. Thank you all for being here. So please, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Yeah, oh, there we go. Great. Actually, I think this might be Carolyn's presentation.
Will I go first, or it's changing?
Yeah, it's...
They're working on it?
Yeah.
There we go.
There it is.
Great. So thanks for having me here today. I'm Jess Coldrey. I'm an artist, engineer, and researcher from Australia. And today I'll be talking about 2 case studies working with flood-affected communities using arts-based approaches. And these came out of a collaboration with my friend Emily Raga. So I'll be speaking through some of the methods that we used in our project. Thank you. So it all started in 2022 when I found myself in the northern rivers of Australia in a town called Nimbin in Australia. This was just after catastrophic floods and landslips and in the region had destabilized the area, and I'd been hired by a tech startup to design and manage the first humanitarian application of drone tree planting. At the same time, my colleague and friend, Emily Ragas, was working in Durban, South Africa on flood relief work. Despite being on different continents, we shared a common interest in the creative arts, and both were practicing as social scientists. Without knowing it, we had independently implemented 2 very similar methods to understand the experiences of 2 very similar communities that were highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change due to living in informal settlements and being exposed to the elements. We collected a lot of data that was quite similar when we caught up and compared our work, and found that especially the sensory data we had collected had a lot of overlap. In Nimbin, where I was focused, the 2022 floods resulted in 4 deaths and 11,000 homes. A massive biodiversity reserve was also destroyed. Meanwhile, in Durban, South Africa, the KwaZulu floods of 2022 resulted in over 400 deaths and impacted around 14,000 homes. Both floods caused a large-scale collapse of sewage infrastructure, compromising drinking water, and significant transport infrastructure collapse made the areas relatively inaccessible for aid, especially due to being informal settlements and floods. Both of these sites had a lot of overlapping challenges in terms of ongoing restoration that made the social factors of restoring and recovering significantly important. Alongside our practical field work supporting the communities with recovery, we'd also both decided to research and reflect on local experiences and track our methodologies and the way we were working in an academic context. Linking our previously unrelated work together inspired us to create the animation Tracing Precarity, a digital animation exploring the sensory experiences of anthropogenically driven natural disasters and natural hazards. Some of the methods we both had actually used on site were collaborative drawing and clay modeling. Generating artworks and artifacts through these processes allowed us to create boundary objects and to speak with the participants, to interview them, to run surveys, to use these objects as a way to relate to them and their sensory experiences. This helped our relief work become more effective and more locally integrated, while also inspiring this artwork. We were very inspired by Pink's concept of sensory ethnography, which emphasizes that ethnographic knowledge is not just created through observing others, but through understanding embodied and in-place experiences. So essentially, a flood doesn't just happen, it happens to a person in a place and in a context. And this kind of mindset and framework really encouraged us to start exploring how the disaster survivors perceived, felt, and inhabited their environments. For example, as I mentioned, both of our workshops included using clay. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, these are some self-representations that the participants in Durban created, and certain parts of their body, you might be able to see the mouth or the heart, are larger, and that's kind of a result of how their self-image had changed as a result of surviving the floods. This is just one example of many data points that inspired us in our project. Representing Airseed Technologies, the drone startup I mentioned, I was responsible for interfacing with the community to build trust through art workshops. Being an informal settlement up in the mountains that was relatively closed off to the outside world, trust was a major concern in developing this project. So working with clay, having that mind-body connection, enabled us to really build a relationship and understand their ingrained knowledge of observing plants and animals interacting together, or there's certain feelings and associations with different species. And using this arts-based collaborative method actually enabled us to co-design the engineering intervention in a way that helped support social cohesion after the flooding event. During the project, I also ran collaborative drawing and mapping exercises with community members, as did Emily. They mapped their land before and after the disaster, deciding which factors they felt were important to represent, and also created representations of what they would like the landscape to look like in 50 years once it had healed in their eyes. One of the most insightful pieces of information that came out of talking about these collaborative drawings was the community's time frame for restoration. We initially had started the project with the assumption that the community would want to restore to post-disaster levels of biodiversity and infrastructure. But through talking about these drawings, we actually came to understand they felt it was part of their life's mission to restore to post-agriculture. And so doing this drawing enabled us to fundamentally challenge what we were aiming to do through supporting them with relief work. Our body is our general medium for having a world, and we really wanted to include this bodily sensory element in our depiction of how climate change affects people. As outsiders, arts-based methods really helped us to build these understandings and understand not only the physical impact of disasters, but also the emotional experience. Using this kind of broader, deeper data set than we knew what to do with at the time in the context of our projects, we decided to start working with animation and reinterpreting shapes and experiences, sounds, shadows, smells that people had recounted to us. So for example, you can see here in the port near Duban, shipping containers had been knocked over like Lego from the floods, and we started playing with rectangles and building blocks and shapes merging and displacing into each other. There's a quick little snippet of the animation here. You can hear some of the sounds of the disaster that the participants described, like scraping metal floating down the river, or eucalyptus branches snapping and the tension of that through sound. And we really wanted to capture this in a sensory and immersive way for viewers, capturing disorientation and a shifting sense of space that accompany these events. The animation kind of goes from dark hues fading into a brighter white, and we were inspired by some of the participants in Duban describing their sensory relations to colour, and white was very associated with healing, rebuilding and renewal. So at the end, the shapes sort of move more slowly. You can see shoots emerging, hear birds, and we wanted to really bring that sense of hope that we felt come out really strongly from the data in both communities in the animation. We were very inspired by the method of creative-led research and research-led creative practice, but saw these more as kind of ad hoc tools and inspiration as we kind of flowed in and out of different methods. And coming, I suppose, from a humanitarian and fieldwork context, we really wanted to kind of tailor-make our methodologies to build trust, to focus on those elements that were most important in this particular setting. Since this project, the initiatives we were involved in have continued to grow. So Airseed Technologies has started using these community-based workshops and structures to expand their programs across Australia. And they excitedly received a large grant from the Red Cross recently to expand their biodiversity restoration work with post-disaster communities. We've exhibited in Canada and Australia so far, and are really excited about finding new opportunities to share what we've created and how we've created to help with climate advocacy. Just a quick thank you to some of the collaborators from the project, obviously my friend Emily Ragus, Dr. Thompson, Moya, Sutherland, Airseed Technologies, and the Red Cross Humanitech Lab. So thanks for having me here today. Great to be at the conference. If you're interested in learning more, exhibition opportunities, or collaborating, please feel free to reach out. But looking forward to the questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. We would have 2 minutes now for any quick clarifying questions you might be having about Jessica's project. If there's any on the floor. If not, I would like to ask you something.
Sure.
So you have been collaborating in harsh, catastrophic settings in a way, right? And working with actors such as the Red Cross, right? So I was interested in getting to know a little bit more about how your embodied research and the creative approaches you've used for that sensory stimulation of the feeling of what it means to be in a catastrophic setting of that kind or in a disaster of that kind, how that might have influenced or impacted or in a way transformed, if at all, some of the ideas or the practice of those practitioners working in disaster response, such as the Red Cross.
So the context of working with the Red Cross was through their humanitarian technology lab. So several startups were involved in sort of piloting, working with communities in new ways. And something the Red Cross really wanted to test was their humanity first framework, which emphasized a lot of factors, like we mentioned, like building trust. And I think, kind of explaining and contextualizing for an engineering and tech startup who wasn't really used to working with community, not only the importance of working with community because they already wanted to do that, they understood the need for that in order for projects to be successful in the long term, but also how to do that and how do you actually start that collaboration and build that trust, especially in a community that's quite close to the outside world. And this was kind of particularly important for this project, having a large drug culture in the region. A lot of the properties were closed to the outside world and very apprehensive to have outsiders sort of see how they were living in their communities. And so that was really unfortunate because it meant that when people were coming to provide aid, they weren't necessarily able to receive that. They might not have been eligible, or they might not have known about it or wanted strangers to come into their very close-knit sort of non-traditional communities. So kind of being able to develop a framework and test and track different ways of building that relationship and building that trust and friendship in many ways was something we kind of wanted to do quite iteratively, hence the kind of mixed methods. And we actually worked with a social scientist to track and survey how those different engagement methods made participants feel, so whether they felt empowered or whether they felt like their thoughts and insights and feelings were being considered by the engineering company. So I guess that kind of inspired the research ties within the project.
Thanks very much. So we're going to move on to our next presenter, Carolyn Kirschner from Goldsmiths University of London. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think the microphone's on now. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm an artist and a researcher and also a lecturer at Goldsmiths. I'll get straight into it. So in short, this is a presentation about error, or in a few more words, I'll be making the case for the intentional misuse of scientific tools and processes as a productive approach to art science research. Error is an intrinsic part of knowledge production. Accidental error, mechanical error, human error, historical error, sometimes intentional error. These different forms of error all hold important roles in advancing disciplines and expanding what we know. The two errors and knowledge production are deeply interconnected. Error can create new knowledge, while attempts at knowledge production often produce error. Some forms of error can be avoided, others cannot. Some are productive, others are not. Some are anticipated, others are a shocking revelation. I'll start by painting a brief landscape of various forms of error, so kind of a very brief taxonomy with a focus on scientific contexts. Number one, processing error. In the 1980s, a large hole appeared in the ozone layer above Antarctica. NASA satellites had been continuously recording atmospheric data from space, but failed to detect this change. As it turns out, NASA software was programmed to automatically discard any extreme outliers in the data, which meant that all measurements of the drastic changes in ozone concentration were inadvertently deleted. Only thanks to Joe Farman, a geophysicist who had installed a single ground sensor for ozone concentration in Antarctica, This was the only reason this grave processing error was eventually brought to light. It's an interesting case where automated data processing to correct for error and outliers ironically produced more error. The eventual discovery of this mistake, though, led to important advances in the handling of climate data and an understanding that historical data is not a reliable benchmark when dealing with the often unprecedented impacts of man-made climate change. A second form of error is instrument error. This, I would argue, is in the category of inevitable errors, as all scientific instruments are subject to margins of error and operate within degrees of uncertainty. Here, the impact on knowledge production depends on researchers' awareness of instrument limitations and their careful calibration and maintenance. A third form of error, everywhere and all around, is accidental error or human error. Most of the time, inconvenient, disruptive, sometimes disastrous. But every so often, human error can lead to transformational discoveries. From X-rays to Viagra, many important scientific or medical discoveries have happened by accident. A fourth category of error is modeling error, which in some cases connects to the previous category of human error. I'll be using weather forecasts as an example for today. The ability of meteorologists to make forecasts about the weather has incrementally improved by about 1 day every decade. In the 1970s, meteorologists could reliably predict 3 days into the future. Today, weather predictions are reliable for about 7 days. However, 8 days into the future is where things get hazy. Despite vast amounts of data, supercomputing, and increasingly sophisticated weather models, the chaos and complexity of the Earth's atmosphere persistently confronts us with the limits of forecastability. And yet, despite the known limitations and errors produced by long-term forecasts, we continue to produce and disseminate them. 14-day and 30-day and year-long ahead of time forecasts are driven perhaps by a cultural desire for some glimpse of the future, however flawed. Economic models operate similarly, undeniably imperfect, and yet still central to shaping consequential decisions across the globe. So those are 2 examples of known modeling error, where error is an acceptable trade-off for a feeling of assurance. This next form of error is part of the natural chronology of knowledge production. In 1962, the economist Fritz Machlup coined the phrase, the half-life of facts. It describes the idea that with the passage of time, knowledge is bound to expire. As new knowledge emerges, old knowledge is exposed as incomplete or imperfect as error. New knowledge, in turn, will eventually be replaced by even newer knowledge, a realization which repositions scientific truth or fact as perhaps a fleeting entity. And the final category of error I'll briefly be touching on, I will call quantum error. Arguably, we're at one of these historical turning points right now of older knowledge being replaced by newer knowledge. Quantum physics has deeply rattled and risks unraveling some long-established and universally believed scientific truths. It's opened in many ways inconceivable spaces of research which push up against our current imaginative capacities as humans. And yet, although we know that the core principles of Newtonian physics, for example, fall apart at very large and very small scales, it's a field of knowledge that remains true enough for now. It's a type of quantum error in the sense that, for now, it's seen from a cultural perspective as both true and not true at the same time. So that's for a quick and flawed and overlapping and incomplete view or overview of the types of errors that run throughout the process of knowledge production. Error is everywhere in so many different forms, many of which occupied a fluid position, perhaps former knowledge or truth that's been revealed as error, or some which operate in spaces that straddle error and non-error simultaneously. I focused on the sciences so far because specifically in the context of scientific disciplines, this prevalence of error makes for interesting tensions. Error in science has led to interesting and important discoveries, but of course it's not something that's intentionally sought out. Margins and sources of error are continuously set out to be minimized. In artistic practice, error is far more difficult to define and locate. It doesn't butt up against the structural underpinnings of the discipline in quite the same way. Meanwhile, scientific research is steered by clear metrics and methodological frameworks. There are correct ways of using scientific equipment, standards, and procedures to follow in data collection, established approaches for the dissemination and impact assessment of research. That's a generalization, but these types of kind of methodological approaches are, of course, foundational to the sciences in order to produce reliable and reproducible results. And yet, science always inherently confronts error. Efforts to expand what we know, how we understand the world, all start in spaces of error and unknown until new theories and knowledges emerge. And especially in the context of the climate crisis, as the ozone example shows, as the planet is kind of pushed to new frontiers, existing knowledge across all disciplines is increasingly pushed to its limits. From this vantage point, to quote Agnieszka Kurant, the very idea of eliminating errors is absurd because it will annihilate the possibility of exceeding the status quo, the existing paradigm. So today I'd like to I guess think about that while scientific methodologies reasonably set out to avoid or minimize error, in the context of art-science collaboration, seeking out error perhaps is a worthwhile pursuit. Thinking about spaces of error as spaces for discovery and as opportunities for knowledge production, for stretching disciplinary boundaries. The types of error spaces here that are particularly interesting to me, and I would say are especially fruitful for art-science collaborations, are spaces where science and the reach of human knowledge currently falters, spaces beyond existing paradigms, so straying into the unknown, the inconceivable, the as of yet unexplainable. And it's in these particular spaces where I want to make the case for the intentional misuse of scientific tools and technologies as a productive methodological approach, where methodological approaches have not yet been set or formalized in the same way as they may have been elsewhere. I'll show just a very brief excerpt from one of my projects to give an example of what I mean in more concrete terms. I've been interested in the Earth's magnetic field as one such space of error and unknown. It's a geophysical phenomenon which to this day remains unexplained and beyond the reach of modern science, beyond a suspicion that fluctuations in the magnetic field are somehow linked to the Earth's liquid iron core. Over the decades, scientists have produced various models of and predictions for the magnetic field, all of which have failed. In this space of errors where scientific knowledge falters and is at its limits is where I see particularly interesting spaces for interdisciplinary exchanges, and where using scientific tools and processes in unconventional ways may create spaces for experimental knowledge production, as well as new meta-perspectives on respective disciplines themselves. So as part of this project, I've been working with outdated scientific models and using data collected by magnetometers, which are instruments used to measure the magnetic field, to produce this landscape of false information, a sculpture which makes tangible the history of errors accumulating in the wake of the Earth's magnetic field. Produced in 3D modeling software Blender, it draws on various data sources, from one of the earliest maps of the Arctic Ocean, which includes a magnetic mountain at its center, the presumed source of the Earth's magnetic field at the time, to more recent predictions for the wandering magnetic pole, which have since been proven false. These are published by the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. At the moment, the North Pole is the magnetic pole is racing towards Siberia, and nobody knows why. The current outcome of this project, this sculpture, is perhaps secondary to the conversation today. It's a work in progress and ideas in progress. And at this point, I would have loved to show a whole range of other examples of art-science collaborations that kind of stray into these spaces of error in interesting ways. But what I'll draw on and kind of conclude with from this project that I've shared, and what I'll briefly reflect on to conclude, are the implications of seeking out spaces where existing knowledge and existing methodological approaches falter, and the possibilities of treating these kinds of error spaces as rich sites for interdisciplinary collaboration. On one hand, of course, the same conditions that to me make this approach interesting are also what makes it difficult to assess in terms of its impact, as it intentionally seeks out spaces beyond established or standardized frameworks at the edges of disciplines. It's by no means a one-size-fits-all. It may have a hugely meaningful impact in one context and be unproductive in another. For scientific practice, the impact of this approach to collaboration is perhaps especially unpredictable. And yet, the creative misuse of scientific tools and an unconstrained relationship to error in the context of art-science collaboration has the potential for many different scales of impact. from technological innovation to new perspectives on topics at the fringes of our current knowledge, to experimental methodologies for collaboration, to opportunities for cultural or structural or epistemological shifts within disciplines, afforded by a view from outside their boundaries. Yes, of course, just one very small way to think about art-science collaboration. There's so many other important methodological approaches, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I hope you don't mind that we will
course.
move on to the next presentation in view of time. But I think they're great, they will be very interesting to understand to what extent error can be mobilized more or less intentionally, but also how to deal with misunderstanding, right? As a somehow, allowing us to collaborate without knowing what we're doing together, right? Our next presenter is Carla Molins-Pitarch, who will be talking about transdisciplinary design toolkit, lab to street, tangible science framework to collaboratively create art, tech, and science experiences. Carla, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining me in this journey to discover the toolkit. Just a quick sneak peek. This is a toolkit. And this is just a glimpse of what it can be made with it. But let's go back to the beginning. It all starts in an Horizon 2020 project in molecular biology called Chrome Design about 5 years ago. And as you can see, we were a couple of researchers. The cool thing is that 13 of them were biologists, and there was only one non-biologist, that was me. And then I had a very large challenge. I wanted to communicate molecular biology because in the end it was the goal of the project. However, I had to also collaborate with all my colleagues into creating an arts and design experience to show society what the project does. And in the end, we began with so many questions that you cannot imagine how complex it got just to start the project. But I tried to summarize it, that I needed to go from the lab to the street, and I was going to do it from my own point of view. And I'm an experienced designer, a creative technologist, and researcher. And for me, the connection was going to be design, but not so much for my collaborators, mainly biologists, biotechnologists, and bioinformaticians. And then I needed to find what's going to connect those bubbles. And I'm going to make it very short, but for today's presentation, I'm going to center on the middle part, on the transdisciplinary design methodologies that are quite young, and they need a little bit of refinement into incorporating it in these kinds of projects that really have a scope that goes beyond where the methods have been developed. So I started figuring out early on some problems. There's always problems. And one of them was that my stakeholders were really unfamiliar with all design methods, all design things. And for them, the unknown was our practices, and anything that was artistic or designerly was super foreign. And so I had an additional goal that I hadn't foreseen before, that was not part of the proposal. I had to foster the collaboration before being able to collaborate. And I needed an approach that maybe it was not foreseen, so I had to create a tool, and I'm going to share the journey that was creating this tool and what was made with it. So in a nutshell, the toolkit wanted to offer a comfort zone for all the participants in the network, but also all the external collaborators that were not familiar with this kind of processes, but we had to create together. So, okay, stage one is, we need something. We need a new tool. And how we discovered that? We were just having some workshops all together, and then there were different unknowns. We didn't have any idea about molecular biology. They didn't have any idea about design, and we had to work together. So I decided to summarize what were my needs in that particular project. We needed a shared lexicon. We needed a common framework to be able to understand where we were and where we were going. A comprehensive methodology, clear checkpoints, because process, processes are long and things take time, and we needed to know that we were heading somewhere. And at the end, in the phrasing of my colleagues, we needed a shared recipe or protocol that makes them feel comfortable, right? And me as well. So I started with something that was common to me, which is the design thinking system. And there are many ways to visualize it, but to me it was, okay, I'm going to craft for something that I know iteratively works into making it work for my own case. And this was the messy start. But it got into something that it was a little bit easier to explain. I added a couple of new phases, like knowledge acquisition, fostering transdisciplinarity, then the applied design research that maybe we are more familiar in this setting, and at the very end, outreach, because this had to get to society. But then, it's not that easy. There are many steps in between. You might not need them all, but you need to acknowledge that the process is not as streamlined and that you might need to involve different people in different parts of the process. That's when I realized that to be able to explain that, I needed a little bit more information to be able to share. I have a physical version here if anyone wants to take a look. But basically, I created a booklet that includes the explanation of all these steps. And then I decided that I was going to share that with the partners and all the collaborations and workshops that I was hosting. And then, as you can see, it has a brief description, and then some tips, and then it's color-coded, so it also helps you visually understand where you are in the process, because for them it was very daunting understanding that those processes really take that much time as their lab processes. So stage 2 was using it. Okay, I have a tool. Let's try it. And I started in a comfort setting with our network. We were able to already have collaborative projects with different settings. And then we started with very simple things, some sketches. But going here with the toolkit, it was easier because we knew what we were expecting. But in the end, this was also used to create final degree projects in collaboration with the biologists and design engineering students that were basically bringing the lab to the street. And this is where all these projects come to place. I don't have time to explain them in detail, but it's a wide variety of mediums and ways to convey complexity that I think we really appreciated having the opportunity to do. And then I was hosting workshops to basically test the toolkit and see how I could improve it in different setups, different universities, different profiles of students, and always creating prototypes, no matter how low resolutions were. It was good to evaluate and to have some action with a tool that it sometimes can be a little bit abstract. Then I had to evaluate it because this was part of my PhD thesis, and I had the opportunity to go to CERN and involve many different disciplines into the evaluation. And the evaluation that I did, it was putting the toolkit in use by having them fill certain graphical forms that would help me visualize where the problems in the toolkit were. And as a summary of the evaluation, they thought the tool was great if it could be a little bit more self-explanatory because it needed a lot of mediation. You always need a designer who's already familiar with some of these things to start. And then the process can be very abstract for some, which we already know that processes can be abstract. And they wanted to test it because they really like it. And they wanted to test it, and now the screen is black and green. Okay, sorry about that. So after that, I thought, okay, I want more input, and I wanted to make it as available as I can. And physical objects are great for, I think, for having a tangible thing and working together, but they are a little bit more difficult to ship across the globe. So I created some kind of how to get started leaflet that it's inside the book, but it's also digital. And then you can get the booklet, and then it also comes with different examples of what you can do, because they wanted examples of how to use the tool, so it has different projects explained in them. And I uploaded the toolkit in an open repository, which has been a great way to involve different members of different communities. So if you want to take a look, you have the QR code in here, or you can take a look to the physical one later. Then just to close, because I think I love sharing process, but I think results also matter to share our impact. I had the opportunity to create an exhibition to show my research, but more importantly, I'm gonna skip the exhibition, and I'm gonna share what was the centerpiece of my research. I created an interactive genome experience that would provide agency to visitors to try to interact with our own genome. And for me, it's not a matter of, oh, the tool great, you can do great things. It's just, we have a process that is starting to work to make things, and we can keep trying and improving that tool to keep doing great things. And just to conclude, molecular biology is complex and it's inherent to the field because there's a lot of lack of good representation, and there are a lot of concepts that are abstract because we don't have the technology yet. And the toolkit doesn't reduce the complexity. However, I do think that we can tackle common challenges that both disciplines have in a way that they didn't consider before, and it helps us move us forward. And design has a very broad spectrum on how we both study and think, both theoretically and practically, that we can apply to many fields. And in molecular biology, it works as well. And in the very end, transdisciplinary methods can support this collaborative science communication process, and we can start bridging this huge gap that so often we have between the lab and the street. And my final thought is that if we help to evolve the designer's role into this new idea of science communication, I think we can little by little move forward with all disciplines together. And I think the toolkit can help, or any toolkit that comes out of creating a tool for that purpose. Thank you very much. And if you have any question, I'm here for you.
Thank you, Carla, for your presentation. I suppose we will have also time in the next block to discuss a little bit more about the conundrums, the problems, all of the issues in the process of your project. We will conclude the series of presentations with Maxim Velli and Lola Kengen, who will be presenting Solar Punk Science, Transforming Epistemologies for a Regenerative Scientific Practice. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tomás. One sec. Would be cool if it stopped raining now, right? That I'm presenting something about solar punk. Sorry, 1 second, wrong. Yeah. So thank you for the introduction, Tomás. We'll be talking a bit about solar punk today, but before we get into that, I just wanted to ask a question to know what kind of an audience I'm addressing now. How many of you are technologists, engineers, or scientists by education and by their job right now? Okay, all right. And don't put your hand down yet. My next question is how many of you actually feel like they can talk confidently about the fact that they do a creative job in their daily life? Okay. Well, some people put their hand up after for the second question. Yeah, now it's working. But this is just to prove a point about the fact that myself also, I feel really uncomfortable talking about the fact that as an engineer, I do a creative job. And it seems that among us here, but also at large in society, we have some sort of a problem about compatibility of technical rigor with creativity. And before I head into the rest of the presentation, I just want to discuss when it starts. And the thing is that it starts really early on. And most of you with a technical inclination probably know how it goes. You know, you're good at math, you're good at science, so you become a nerd. And when you become a nerd, well, you might have some problems with your social life, but at the same time, in society, that's kind of appreciated. you are incentivized to become an even nerdier person because then you can be of most use for society. Why would you be interested in becoming like a well-rounded person that is embedded in the context and the philosophy of your culture, et cetera, et cetera? You just become a nerd and you specialize even further. So for the sake of this presentation, I would like to ask a what-if question. You know, what if this was not the case? What if we respected the technical rigor just as much as we respected the creative output of our technologists, engineers, and scientists? And this is great to be giving this presentation after the toolkit because perhaps this is another thought experiment that we can engage in to understand the meaning of such frameworks. So the first what-if question is about schools, because that's where our engineering education starts. And the thing is that our schools are made for us to compete with one another, not to collaborate. They're made for us to do tests and to perform on academic rankings to ultimately get into the best schools where we specialize even further in our nerdy disciplines. So what if this was not the case and instead our schools were more of community spaces where we had the opportunity to engage both in horizontal learning and in vertical learning so that our students from day one that they become part of society feel like they are contributing meaningfully to it. And if we then proceed to the universities, we can imagine what our universities would look like if they were not also just spaces where we had this one-sided, huge auditorium education where we're taught how to perform the job that we ultimately will be doing. Because instead, we can envision that universities would look more like something that doesn't have majors and minors, but instead where people come together to explore particular problems, real tangible problems in the outside world. And they just spend a few years exploring how to tackle these problems from a variety of angles. On the go, collaborating with people who are more interested in anthropology, in science, in the art, in computer science, but ultimately to contribute to solving these urgent, present problems that we have in society at the moment. And finally, probably the saddest part is when we get out of these universities and we engage in something that we're going to be doing for the rest of our lives. So we're going to be working. And the thing is that academic research usually is governed by the publish and perish concept, as well as short-term funding cycles, which were poignantly addressed today in the morning meeting. But what if our work didn't have to look like this? And what if we didn't restrict ourselves to asking the question of can we do this, but also should we do this, and for who are we doing this? What if our work was deeply entangled with the communities that we're a part of? And perhaps in this kind of a world, the prestige of a researcher would not be determined by the H index, but instead by the actual meaningful impact that they're delivering for their communities and their environments.
All of this sounds great, right? You just witnessed a scientist desperately trying to understand where things went wrong and how to fix that. And the series of what-if questions that Maxim just shared with us, it relates to this concept that comes to us from the field of utopian studies that is called the education of our desire. So educating our desire is about breaking away from this logic of no alternative. It's about questioning the limitations that we are presented as immutable, turning to the epistemologies that help us prove otherwise. And it's about practicing this speculative thinking and turning to radical hope, the belief that things could be different. So how do we educate our desire?
Lower one.
The lower one, okay.
Yep. Yeah.
So how do we educate our desire? If you don't really know where to start, the solar punk movement is all about reclaiming this hope for more desirable and livable futures, a hope that we've all been stripped away from. And solarpunk started as an aesthetic on Tumblr in the 2000s, with people started to depict worlds in which humans lived in harmony with nature. And as you can imagine, as people started having these visions, they necessarily started to think about the kind of politics and social structures that would be conducive of such reality. And in the tradition of all the punks, steampunk, cyberpunk that came before it, the punk in solarpunk refers to this thing that now being hopeful in a world where doomerism and pessimism prevail is punk. And as for the solar, it refers to the movement's interest in renewable energy sources and decentralized infrastructures. But let us be clear that solarpunk is not a blueprint for us to follow. It is what can be what is called a mimetic engine. So it's a kind of force that propagates cultural ideas and shapes worldviews. And solarpunk does so by making us envision a desirable outcome for the future in contrast to other possible and often more dystopian narratives. It's a productive imaginary force for us to act in the present. And despite utopias and dystopian narratives being two sides of the same coin, dystopian and post-apocalyptic narratives dominate our mainstream culture. And we believe that this imbalance is a problem because we need cultural references that make us critically think about avenues for change and not solely highlight problems. Because our world resembles too closely the dystopias that cyberpunk has been warning us about since the 80s. And solarpunk recognizes the historical link between science fiction and reality and kind of reverse engineers that by inviting us to speculate about desirable futures and the various ways in which they could come to exist. So now that you have an idea of what solarpunk and mimetic engines are, what does this mean for science and technology? Why should scientists and people who are innovating even care about hopeful and speculative visions? First of all, we think that it is important to create spaces and ways for people in science to engage in reflections about their own subjectivity, their values, their hopes, their fears, their aspirations, and put those in dialogue with their work. And this is especially important in domains where the so-called objectivity of the knower is the norm. Second of all, we also believe that although there are different interpretations of solarpunk, it is a movement that gears us towards knowledges, epistemologies, and methodologies that are often overlooked or have been historically dismissed in some Western scientific practices and communities, such as Eastern and indigenous knowledge, or even humanities or social sciences. And solarpunk can be a conduit for them, for scientists to get curious about those other ways of knowing. And lastly, solarpunk can help provides like a reason for scientists to critically reflect on whether the technologies and the kind of knowledges that they produce ultimately leads to a desirable future. So are they accessible? Are they empowering? Are they convivial? And we believe that by creating their vision of a world they desire for themselves and for others, scientists can might become more motivated to attain it and ultimately gaining agency and acting more responsibly to fulfill their vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. I think we're going to jump straight into the discussion, but I think we need to make some adjustments. You know, we had thought of 3 blocks. Maybe we need to reduce it to 2. So there are 2 things, or the 2 blocks that in which I would like to, open up a conversation about your different projects. Allow me to take some time just to delineate them, and maybe we can then go into both of them. One of them has to do with how your different projects are discussing the interdisciplinary encounter as something that is much more complicated than we might think of, right? It's not just discipline, here you go, right? And it's interesting, or at least that I found it very interesting, and I would like to expand a little bit on that, how your different proposals somehow shape or suggest ways of shaping that interdisciplinary encounter through error, through the development of connections with mythology, design methodologies, drawing on ethnography to produce a design output, or even by creating a manifesto, right? A manifesto that would be enabling you to become a different kind of practitioner, when you go at the encounter. I would like us to take some time to delineate a bit the differences in your strategies in trying to do so, because I think there are epistemic and methodological implications in all of them. And the second strand that I would like us to dwell a little bit on has to do with the difference or distinctiveness of the different practices and modes of knowledge that somehow your projects bring together, right? I think in Chris Salter's keynote presentation the other day, there was an emphasis in science not being one, art not being one, right? And I think one of the main issues that we need to deal with is precisely this multiplicity of the forms of knowledge that come at the encounter. Somehow, there has been a lot of debate about whether interdisciplinarity is the term. Some others would be more sort of trying to advocate towards transdisciplinarity, transcending the sort of packaged containers of the disciplines that come at the encounter. Some others might be discussing the need for adisciplinarity as an attempt at providing a different grounding for this encounter. I would like us to talk a little bit about how your different projects might allow us to develop a little bit this vocabulary, of how, what does it mean to put things together and for what purpose. So on the first thing, I don't know, I would really love to know a little bit more how error might matter as a way of creating a different sort of encounter when error is somehow purposefully done as a way of reshuffling things, or mythology, or manifestos. I don't know. So how are we trying to shape this encounter? I don't know whether any of you might want to react to the others' presentations rather than advocating for your own version. Was there anything that you found was interesting in how others were approaching that you thought could be something of relevance for your own projects? You can speak freely without...
For me, I think I found the design kit very interesting, the design frameworks, because I do come from an engineering background. I'm a bioengineer. I work with biomaterials. And I have personal experiences of working in teams where it's necessary to kind of communicate the science beyond what is happening in the lab, because otherwise, who the hell needs these biomaterials, and why do we even want to transition, to materials that aren't the same as we're used to? So when we consider those kind of interactions in the lab, you kind of have to tell the scientists why all of these conversations about ecologies of care, like, all these really vague things that lack the technical rigor in the traditional sense of that word, why are they important to be included in the conversation when you're even thinking about your experimental design? And vice versa, when you talk to the designers, you have to explain to them that things take time and things have to be repeated 20,000 times until you actually get something. But I think that in the synthesis of the two lies the real power to uncover the real solutions, the transdisciplinary, adisciplinary, whatever it might be. And I believe that one of the first steps is really to create such frameworks which would aid teams to kind of get themselves in the right direction. And ultimately, I think once you get it rolling, you will get the inertia for the engineers, for both the engineers and the scientists, to understand the value of the other practice and kind of think about it for yourself, even without having a degree, a PhD in biotechnology or an MA in design.
If I may add to that, I believe that sometimes the tool is perceived as a way to get to an end goal, that it is the tangible product that we've seen, either an art piece, an exhibition, or an interaction. But there was something that maybe I didn't mention in the presentation, that it was about creating both a safe space and a relationship of trust with the network, because the unknown for them, besides being uncomfortable, it comes from a position of unwillingness to maybe fail with something that they don't know. And for me, the toolkit and being able to provide the framework and maybe for them a little bit more rigor with something that they don't know, it was able to, with time, because it still took, I would say, more than a year and a half to create a relationship of trust. And then the collaboration started, not before when we really wanted it to start.
I can perhaps speak a little bit as well to the kind of concept of an interpersonal error and how that can kind of propel you into being able to collaborate more effectively. I feel as sort of in these multiple, disciplinary spaces, often, sometimes entering as an outsider, you play the role of a mediator, entering kind of an unknown space and having to sort of alter yourself and speak different languages, and there is error inherently in that and experimenting into sort of what role you're to play. And I think that errors in that circumstance really help you to challenge your assumptions. So say, for example, when we thought the time frame was restoring to 2 years ago, it's actually about restoring to 100 years ago, and encountering that error or that mismatch enabled a very quick kind of response and alteration of aims, and even the way you kind of enter those spaces. So my first day showing up on site in Nimbin after the landslips, I was thinking, okay, we're an engineering company, we need to project professionalism and credibility. So I, arrived in a suit with a handshake, and that, I suppose you could term as an interpersonal error, because they reached out with a g'day and a knuckle punch and how you going and let's have a tea party or let's go for a walk and chat. And so, the second day I was able to come back, I've got a bucket hat with shrooms on it and I go in with the knuckle punch, and building that friendship and being able to alter yourself to be a mediator and to sit between those spaces is something that inherently has errors within it. But those kind of moments and clashes, if you can still hold that space and use that as a way to iterate, can build deeper connections and drive impact in more comprehensive ways.
I think for me, it's something that was really interesting in Guillemette's presentation, this kind of, I guess, other perspective on the tool of a climate model from, bringing in maybe a perspective of mythology or anthropomorphizing this tool in some way, and kind of understanding, I guess, how some of those surrounding assumptions produce modeling error, or I guess which kinds of error are inherent to the model. I think it pushes maybe the perspective that you offer on climate modeling into a space that is quite difficult to define, and that's, to me, is where it then becomes interesting, that it's kind of like on the edges of scientific practice maybe, and somewhere on the edges of artistic practice, and it's in that not quite being able to define, to me, maybe where there's also something, maybe it's a space of mutual comfort in there somewhere. One example I would have liked to share that maybe also connects in some way to this is the work of a group called the Indigenous Mapping Collective, kind of thinking about ways of intentionally misusing scientific instruments. They work together with scientists using satellites and kind of other remote sensing technologies to produce alternative maps of landscapes that are kind of counter-mapping practices and kind of anti-colonial. And it's like, it's those kinds of spaces. I don't know where that act transports the work of that group into. It's using scientific tools, it's maybe using kind of creative methods, it's using or like bringing in indigenous ways of knowing. And it's like, it's in the edge space. It's not necessarily producing maps that are scientifically useful, at least in the traditional sense, but it's a space that maybe offers perspectives back on more established kind of ways of working and ways of knowing that are also legitimate, but maybe once that mirror is held up, maybe that kind of shared look at each other allows something new or a stretching or kind of like a,
There's a thread that I think I found very interesting in all of your talks. So from your embodied attempt at sensitizing yourself to the problem, your manifesto, your attempt at somehow bringing them to the design table, and pinning things down using myth or using error. There is an attempt, like I said, at shaping an encounter, right? But it's interesting that Guillemette was now mentioning the encounter is never symmetrical, right? The different forms of knowledge there, traveling to the encounter, are full of, hierarchies, truth regimes, notions of who is a better scientist, understandings of, so there are all of these things there. I would like to have a sense of how, in your particular works, you might have been trying to undo some of these regimes or hierarchies of truth, hierarchies and regimes of what knowledge matters, and the concrete procedures. I mean, we have had a hint, a manifesto is a way of somehow sensitizing you to become being a designer or an engineer in a different way, right? Maybe the design toolkit that you proposed was a different way of generating that encounter. The myth is somehow also pushing scientists off the cliff of rationality, right? And error or these embodied sensory aspects might, I don't know, helping us produce that. But I would like to get a sense from you of how you have been encountering the difficulties and problems in doing that.
If I want to start with Guillemotte's approach on the balance, because I think balance, or definitely unbalance, it's one of the things of the encounters that makes them so challenging. In my particular case, as you've seen, the proportion in the network was really unproportioned. Like it was 13:1 in terms of the disciplinary roles that we had at the beginning of the project, and the idea was to diffuse these roles, and hence the transdisciplinary made sense in order to be able to try to blur these boundaries. But it's not the same having a 1-to-1 encounter than having a 13:1 encounter, and sustained among such a long time. And I think when there's unbalance, it does require a lot of determination and different strategies to identify what is working and what is not working, because there's no problem if you are losing one person, because you really can catch up with that and try to recover the collaboration. But the stakes are very high when there's a larger group. And I think it's important to also understand the balance that you have in that collaboration, for example.
I suppose determining what knowledge is important within that initial space was also obviously a factor in the work we did. I think, a normal ecological restoration project, the ecologists would go in, do ground truthing, test the soil, do research about local species, come up with a plan, restore it. And the general timeframes for monitoring and funding to kind of keep working with that site, usually it's about 2 or 3 years. So a lot of projects get funded, they get planted, and then, something over here shiny and new, you plant that one dies, and it's this kind of shiny object syndrome. So I suppose we could have started the project thinking, we have ecologists, they have all the knowledge they need in order to rebuild this landscape. Whereas the knowledge that was required for success in 100 years, which was the time frame for the community, that actually required, community buy-in. That required them to kind of put their efforts into socially accepting that restoration, accepting those species, and wanting to continue to be shepherds for that space. So then the local knowledge became more powerful and more important in sort of generating that buy-in. And maybe if a certain large bird was attracted to a certain bush, then birds would kind of fight and the owners would get rid of that plant. Or maybe they had seen interactions with different worms or bugs that made them very apprehensive towards certain species. And so if you had have restored using that species, that wouldn't have been socially acceptable, and that missing link of the local knowledge would have kind of led to the project's failure. So I think really collaborating on the aims of what you're doing will help reflect what knowledge you actually need within that for that long-term success.
I really like the phrase, the zone of contact, as kind of a place where these kinds of encounters might happen. I guess for me, maybe a challenge of seeking out these edge spaces or seeking out error. I guess that isn't how I would be able to ordinarily frame the start of a project or convince anyone that that's a worthwhile encounter or a worthwhile thing to fund or spend time on. Yeah, so it's maybe navigating those. There are questions around impact, and if spaces of unpredictability and spaces at the edges are the thing you're interested in, then that is the kind of, I guess, the struggle, either finding people that maybe share that an interest in that zone of contact, or yeah.
Yeah,
I'll leave it there.
I just want to add to that right now we're in this space which is where there's a lot of people who are really interested in this interdisciplinary thing. And it's a bit of an echo chamber, of course, because 83% of research funded is not interdisciplinary, or even more. I don't know, it's crazy numbers, but and to me it really has to do with the question of, okay, how do we actually want to have non-interdisciplinary research? Like, is there a lot of research that is not inherently not interdisciplinary? Do you really have to put us onto this like shiny pedestal of, okay, these are like the weird kids doing art because you are a scientist that is interested in interdisciplinarity? Because that's kind of what I have, like, that's the feeling that we get here sitting, because we're here as these special people for some reason. Whereas for me, it's more like a desirable outcome, that it's more of a norm that everyone who is a scientist should be interested in seeking out these collaborations, because then ultimately you usually find more meaningful outcomes for your own research and for the time you're investing into your work and life in general.
Any more?
Yeah, I was thinking on what he was saying, that I believe that like we've been pointing out so many problems, because I think tackling the problems help us find further solutions. And as we bring so many points of view in this kind of discussion, I think it's what we need to do. However, I think there's a glimpse of change. For example, in my research project, the network, it was a molecular biology project, Horizon 2020 project in life sciences track. Having a designer as a full-time partner was an exception, and I know the privilege that has been being part of that project, but to me is the starting, like the beginning of a little bit of change and the glimpse for the future. So I want to believe that like lots of scientists are really starting to see the value and the potential impact that it can have, and then hopefully we will see more kinds of these projects very, very soon.
We'll see what the policy workshop comes out with, and then
Yeah.
they might have all the solutions.
Since it's happening at the same time as this one, we cannot know, right? I was wondering whether anyone in the room would like to add up the conversation with any questions or reflections. So we have one here and one here. Three. So do you mind if we take the three of these comments together?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm a bit more synth pop C-punk, but I dig the solar punk. And like, let's just all agree that Tumblr is the golden age of the internet. So thank you for bringing that. I really enjoyed all the panels, and I really the kits that were being put together. I'd really like to talk more, because I think, like I've been building labs and doing this kind of open science thing for a while, and so I really appreciate that, the engineering work. My question though is for Carolyn. I was curious about. I have the suspicion that, like, you did this really nice overview and cohesive kind of work in all kinds of different disciplines on error. And I have this idea that for a theory to actually work in terms of knowledge, for it to be something that we can actually contest, that we can actually, consent to, and we can actually have in a space that can work with the community and can grow in some way and actually can be scientific, I think fallibility is sort of intrinsic to that. So I wonder what you think of that. How much, because I understand there's also a subversion going on, right? Like, you're interested in sort of saying, okay, well, this, here's the all-holy kind of temple, and here's all the fuck-ups, and, like, this is kind of what's really going on. At the same time, I'm like, you're kind of delineating for me the places, the cracks where it happens, right? The places where knowledge really is going on, you know, and in a way, kind of like what a scientist ideally wants to do, I'd like to think, is make problems pliable, make them understandable, you know, like make these problems that we think are important into forms that maybe aren't exactly what's going on in the world, but at least there's something we can work with, you know? So I wonder what you think about that, like how much you think, like how much you're interested in sort of like Peirce infallibility and how maybe this is getting a little bit more into that you're kind of coming from a new angle to get into what science is doing or could do or maybe should do more, or is it something that's lacking, you know? Is it something that you see that maybe it's not doing it enough or that we need just these interventions for the sake of themselves?
You mind if we take
Of course.
all three?
Okay, can you hear me? Yep. I think we talked a lot about like arts and science collaboration as two very different things that sometimes overlap. But I kind of see in this group people that are more in between that spectrum, kind of having the role of more of like a translator or a connector. And I think that might be an interesting strategy for us to think about those collaborations, how we build teams that kind of bridge those gaps. You know, those people that when you're with your art friends, you're the technical person. When you're with your technical friends, you're the art person. I'm sure a lot of people here identify with that. And yeah, no, I just wanted to hear if within your experience, how do you see that role? Do you see yourself in that role? And do you think that made a difference in the collaboration?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all your amazing presentations. In relation to this last comment, I wanted something that I'd like to know if all your projects that you've shown here emerged through the process, or whether you had the methods before, because it feels that they were very generative for you, and I was wondering whether these spaces of friction actually, even if you're translators or whatever we want to describe your role, make you have to think in new ways, develop new methods. So basically, what's the relationship between these projects and processes and the ones you were doing before, and whether you see emergence?
So how about you answer your question? And then there is a round in which each of you tries to respond to these two. Does that sound okay?
Great.
Okay, I will do my best. I also I want to, hopefully I've understood the question correctly. If not, we can also talk more afterwards. I think I interpreted your question kind of around whether I was critiquing maybe science, or sort of where the productive areas are in terms of kind of traditional scientific research methods. Maybe I misunderstood, but I'll start there and we can talk more. So my I guess presentation, or kind of like framing around error, by no means I intend as a critique of science. I think I was trying to draw attention to the spaces where scientific practice is in progress, is not yet able to kind of offer the answers or the knowledge. And so it's those fringe spaces really specifically that I was talking about, rather than kind of scientific, or trying to offer a critique of scientific practice as a whole. The example I was giving was the Earth's magnetic field is a kind of a geophysical phenomenon that for decades, maybe centuries, there have been attempts at understanding, explaining it through scientific methods, scientific research. And of course, there is really valuable and really important research that is happening in scientific contexts at kind of understanding our relationship to the magnetic field. But the underlying kind of rules of it are a mystery. So many models, so many predictions have been made, and they still are not able to understand this thing that is that's everywhere and impacts our existence on the Earth. And so that's like an example of, it's a very, very small kind of fringe space, but that to me offers an interesting chance maybe for collaboration, or like exchanges with other disciplines in interesting ways, exactly because there are all of these tools and methodologies. They're not quite able to do what they need to do yet. And so that to me creates sort of a shared space of possibility, maybe, because there's a not quite there in the science, there's a kind of maybe an interest, but also not quite knowing what to do with it from my perspective, for example. And so that maybe could be a space where then something interesting could emerge, or a type of interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary or transdisciplinary exchange could take place. So it's kind of a site of contact, maybe like what Guillemette was calling it. Yeah, and that really is all I was kind of concerned with. I don't know enough about scientific practice as a whole for that to have been kind of the intended sort of subject of this kind of topic of errors.
Just to reiterate, there was a question on the type of role one plays, facilitator, translator, etc., whether you would like to resonate to that. There was a question about the type of project, whether the project was designed interdisciplinarily or whether this was an emergence of the encounter. Should we finish with a small round in which you try to tackle these two concerns?
Yeah, sure. So the connector archetype is absolutely one that I resonate with, and I find a lot of people working in these sort of places take on. And I think part of that is not necessarily deeply resonating with one discipline yourself, but being able to empathize with the concerns of different disciplines. So say, you know, designers being concerned with process and function in many cases, or engineers being concerned with you know, systems and processes and actions. And I think you can kind of embody these concerns without having had specific training in that discipline, and that allows you to kind of borrow tools, methods, inspiration to kind of craft the perfect cocktail of what's kind of needed to bring people together in that situation. And I think, as you mentioned, with the kind of snowball agile approach, if you do have the space to do that, I think that's something that does allow you to straddle those spaces and be that connector in quite an agile way. And I'm fortunate that kind of the short time frame of having a humanitarian project allows for that like rapid on the ground thinking. But I would imagine there's, you know, different pressures and concerns in academic environments. And you know, I was fortunate to do a dissertation on a similar topic, so I kind of had some intuition about what some of the concerns would be before rushing in and having to spend a week to design the methods. But I think that, you know, sometimes time isn't on your side in that case, and yeah, kind of allowing yourself or your method or your framing or funding to sort of react to your emerging theories or intuition or methods is something that can really serve you in these situations where the unknown is a very large factor.
Yeah, and for me, I would agree with Guillemette that definitely translator is not the word. I sometimes find myself, I think, in between a facilitator and a mediator, because I think there's a gradient in which you are gonna fit depending on the context that you are. When you are working in this space that sometimes is felt more transdisciplinary, you don't fit any of the boxes that are given by default. And depending on where I am, I'm not artist enough, I'm not scientist enough, I'm even not designer enough. So it's always trying to find your place and adapt to the situation, and then the role is going to adapt. So then you can go in between this spectrum. And as for the process, I think is quite similar in that sense that I've been working on this kind of research for many years. But the thing is that I had the opportunity to get closer and closer and closer to the scientific context. Before, it was me just knocking doors and waiting for someone to answer. And then, of course, the process was different because I didn't have enough point of view to contrast like the process that now it's a toolkit, but before it was the process that I used with my collaborators. With the network and all the many encounters that I could have, I had the opportunity, I think, to make it more inclusive and to evolve into something that I would not only use, but many other people would use and shape it as a tool. So the process is evolving, and it will keep evolving as much that we involve many people in the process.
As for us, I think I'm not sure if the translator question really applies, but what we kind of saw in Solarpunk and Memetic Engine is the fact that it is very accessible to anyone and can be used to create frameworks or spaces, games, in any kind of context, in any kind of disciplinary context, to kind of open up the space of imagination, of freedom, of exchange. And it really stemmed from like our personal experience as students doing research, so in natural sciences and social science, and also seeing that our generation, there's a big, understanding of problems, but at the same time, like a lot of hope and despair, and also conversations about when we talk about society and change, we often hit very quickly a dead end when we start to think about problems in the sense of like what is feasible, what we can do. So when we think about what we desire and we kind of break away from like the current present, it allows us to maybe understand things in a different way, and also understanding things about ourselves, like our own blockages in a way. So this is like the kind of generative power we saw in Solarpunk, and why we think it would be really useful to be applied in many different disciplines and contexts.
But in general, when I had the idea, why I had the idea to do like a podcast on Solarpunk is because I graduated with a degree in biotechnology, and I was like, well, okay, let's do this, let's make it look like Neri Oxman wants the world to look like. And the thing is that not too many people were on board with me. Like in a cohort of 200 people, I don't know how many even knew the name and knew about biodesign, and kind of were seeking to envision these worlds that looked very different from what we're occupying right now. Because right now, indeed, it doesn't look very desirable, like the world that we live in. It's perhaps better than it used to be, but it's not like something to strive for. It's not your ideal scenario. So, and then I thought, okay, I'll find myself a social sciences person and we'll do it together, because I'm like the technical person and she's the social scientist. So I found Lola at university. And then I thought, okay, we're going to do this podcast and I'll be talking about the technical stuff and she'll be talking about the social stuff, because she has a background in social sustainability. Well, and then very quickly we started making the first like 7 episodes were just about politics. So I really very quickly understood that it was not a technical problem by all means, achieving this kind of, or like exceeding this boundary of imagination that we were all kind of forced into. And that made me be a translator for myself and just put myself in a different role. Yeah, and then we did some episodes on biomaterials, but that was after.
Yeah. Yeah.
I imagine we must all be tired and wanting to have lunch. Before we break for lunch, allow me just to thank you for this lovely conversation. I have learned a lot. I mean, maybe they are sorting out everything for us in the other room, but I think there are many things that can be done to produce contact zones, create fringe spaces, sensitize oneself, create visions and imaginations of the future, even becoming a facilitator, which are things that happen at that very encounter, and it's mostly on us. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.